You know what's strange? The most powerful forms of influence rarely look like influence at all. Nobody waves a watch in front of your face. Nobody whispers mysterious words that magically take control of your mind. Real influence is much quieter than that. It hides inside ordinary conversations, simple questions, and tiny decisions you barely remember making. And by the time you realize someone has influenced you, the conversation is already over. I'm Ben, and today I want to show you 5 psychological techniques that are often described as dark psychology. Not because they're supernatural, and not because they can magically control anyone, but because, in the wrong hands, they can be used to manipulate people who don't recognize what's happening. The good news is that once you understand these patterns, they become much easier to spot. And sometimes, simply recognizing them is enough to avoid falling for them. Let me ask you something. Have you ever promised yourself you weren't going to buy anything, walked into a store just to look around, and somehow walked out carrying a shopping bag? Or maybe you planned to say no during a conversation, but somehow found yourself agreeing anyway. You replay the moment later and think, why did I say yes? Most people assume they simply made a bad decision. But what if your decision wasn't as independent as you believed? Our brains are incredible. They process millions of pieces of information every second. If we had to analyze every single choice logically, we'd never get anything done. So instead, our minds create shortcuts. Most of the time, those shortcuts help us survive. But sometimes, they can quietly work against us. That's exactly where psychological influence begins. The first technique is so simple that most people completely ignore it. In fact, you've probably experienced it dozens of times without ever noticing. Imagine you're sitting across from someone at a coffee shop. They asked you one simple question. So, how have things been lately? You answer. Maybe you talk for 20 seconds. Maybe 30. Then something unexpected happens. They don't interrupt. They don't ask another question. They don't even speak. They simply look at you and wait. At first, the silence feels normal. Then it becomes uncomfortable. A few more seconds pass. Suddenly, you hear yourself speaking again. You begin explaining details nobody asked for. You start justifying your decisions. You even mention things you never intended to share. Why? Because silence makes most people uncomfortable. Our brains are naturally wired to complete unfinished social interactions. A conversation that suddenly becomes silent can feel strangely incomplete, almost like a sentence missing its final word. Without realizing it, many people begin filling that empty space themselves. Experienced interviewers, therapists, and negotiators often understand this better than anyone else. They know that silence isn't always empty. Sometimes, silence encourages reflection. Sometimes it encourages people to continue speaking voluntarily. Not because they're forced to, but because their own mind wants the conversation to keep moving. Now picture Ben sitting across from someone in a quiet room. He asks one question. He smiles politely. Then he says absolutely nothing. The clock on the wall keeps ticking. 5 seconds. 7 seconds. 10 seconds. The other person starts laughing nervously. Then they begin talking again. Not because Ben manipulated them with magic. Not because he threatened them. Simply because the silence became louder than the conversation itself. The interesting part is that when people finally leave, they usually believe every word they shared was completely their own decision. And technically, they're right. Nobody forced them. Their own discomfort did. But here's where things become even more interesting. Silence only works after someone has already entered the conversation. The next technique begins shaping decisions before people even realize they've started making one. Imagine you're shopping for a new phone. You walk into the store with one simple goal, just to look around. A salesperson approaches with a friendly smile and says, "Would you prefer the black model or the silver one?" Did you notice what just happened? They never asked if you wanted to buy the phone. Your brain quietly skipped the biggest question and jumped straight to comparing colors. This is one of the oldest communication techniques in the world. Instead of arguing with your decision, someone simply redirects your attention toward a smaller decision that feels easier to make. Our brains love certainty. Faced with a difficult question, they naturally search for the simplest path forward. Choosing between two colors feels much easier than deciding whether to spend hundreds of dollars. That's why carefully framed choices can sometimes influence the direction of a conversation. The key isn't removing someone's freedom to choose. The key is deciding which question occupies their attention. Think about how often this happens during an ordinary day. A streaming service asks whether you'd like the monthly plan or the yearly plan. A waiter asks whether you'd like fries or salad with your meal. A parent asks a child, "Do you want to brush your teeth before your shower or after your shower?" The child feels independent because they're making a choice. Yet the important decision was already quietly accepted. Ben once described it like standing in front of two open doors. Most people spend so much time deciding which door to walk through that they never stop to ask who built the hallway in the first place. That's what makes this technique so fascinating. It doesn't force people to think differently. It simply encourages them to think about something else first. Now here's the part most people never notice. Even after making the choice, they usually feel completely independent. They don't feel pressured. They don't feel manipulated. In fact, if someone suggested they had been influenced, they'd probably laugh and say, "No. It was my decision." And maybe it was. Influence doesn't erase free will. It simply nudges attention. What someone ultimately decides still depends on countless personal factors, experiences, emotions, and values. But attention is powerful. Wherever attention goes, decisions often follow. Now imagine something even stranger. What if you could make someone feel comfortable around you without saying anything particularly impressive? Not by telling better stories. Not by being funnier. Not by pretending to be someone you're not. Simply by making their brain feel like it's looking into a mirror. Have you ever met someone for the very first time and felt like you'd known them for years? Sometimes people call it chemistry. Sometimes they call it good vibes. But psychology offers another possible explanation. Human beings naturally pay attention to familiarity. When someone moves the way we move, speaks at a similar pace, or shares our conversational rhythm, our brains often interpret those subtle similarities as signs of safety. Watch two close friends sitting in a cafe. One reaches for a cup. A few seconds later, the other does the same. One leans back in the chair. Soon the other leans back too. They aren't consciously copying each other. It simply happens naturally because people who feel connected often begin reflecting one another without realizing it. Now imagine Ben entering a room full of strangers. Instead of trying to become the loudest person there, he quietly observes. One man speaks slowly and calmly. Ben slows his own pace slightly. Another smiles warmly while talking. Ben naturally returns the smile. A woman gestures gently with her hands while explaining a story. Ben's own gestures become just a little softer. Nothing is exaggerated. Nothing feels fake. If anyone noticed, it would probably seem like coincidence. That's the secret. Effective mirroring is almost invisible. The moment it becomes obvious, it stops feeling natural. But when it's subtle, many people simply walk away with a strange feeling that they enjoyed the conversation. Researchers have found that small similarities in behavior can contribute to rapport in many situations, although trust always depends on much more than body language alone. Mirroring doesn't hypnotize people. It doesn't guarantee agreement. It doesn't magically create friendship. But it can make conversations feel smoother because familiarity reduces uncertainty. And uncertainty is something the human brain constantly tries to eliminate. But there is one feeling even stronger than familiarity. The feeling that someone truly understands you. That's where the next technique begins. Think about the last time someone looked at you and said, "You seem worried." Chances are your first reaction wasn't to argue. It was to think about whether they were right. That's because every person wants to feel understood. Long before we search for solutions, we search for someone who understands what we're feeling. This is where labeling becomes surprisingly powerful. Instead of trying to change another person's opinion, you simply put their emotion into words. "It seems like you're frustrated." It sounds like you're disappointed.